Vivid verses.
I was making coffee. The kind of morning where the light comes in flat and gray through the kitchen window, and you're not thinking about anything much at all. My mother's voice on the other end was steady. She'd had time to compose herself, I think, before she dialed. Gran had passed in the night, quietly, in her own bed, which was the only way she ever would have agreed to go. She was 81 years old and had lived every one of those years on her own terms. I said the right things. I meant them. I put the phone down and stood at the counter for a long moment with my coffee going cold. Nadia came into the kitchen in her dressing gown, read my face, and came to put her arms around me. She smelled of sleep and her shampoo, and she held on for a while without saying anything, which was the right thing to do. I remember thinking that. I remember registering it as a point in her favor, the way I suppose you do when a relationship has been running long enough that you've started keeping quiet tallies without meaning to. "I'm so sorry," she said eventually. "She had a good run," I said, which is what you say. It's even true. It just doesn't help much. She made fresh coffee and sat with me at the table and let me talk about Gran for a while. The allotment she'd kept until she was 78, the absolute iron refusal to use a microwave, the way she'd call me by my father's name sometimes, and then catch herself and laugh. Nadia listened. She asked a question or two. She seemed present. It was only later, days later, when I was deep in the business of estate administration, death certificates and solicitors, and the particular beige misery of probate paperwork, that I started to notice the edges of things. Grand Solicitor was a man named Clive Abernathy. I'd met him once before at the signing of the will some years back, and my impression then was of a man who had been doing this work for a very long time and had developed, as a result, a kind of careful, undemonstrative competence. He was not warm, exactly, but he was thorough. He called me Mr. Okafor in a way that felt like a form of respect rather than formality. We spoke on the phone twice in the first week. The estate was not enormous. Gran had never been a wealthy woman by any external measure, but she had been careful her entire life. A modest property, fully owned. Savings accumulated with the patience of someone who had grown up understanding that money did not replenish itself automatically. Some premium bonds. A few small investments she'd made in the 90s and simply left alone. By the time it was totaled up, the figure was meaningful. Not life-changing in the way that phrase usually means, but significant, enough to matter. Nadia knew the rough shape of it. I told her in the days after the funeral, sitting on the back patio with a bottle of wine we weren't really tasting. It felt right to be honest. We'd been together long enough. She'd been supportive. I told her it was somewhere in the region of 60 to 70,000, pinning the property valuation. She nodded and said something like, "Your Gran was so careful, wasn't she?" And I'd agreed, and we'd sat there in the evening until the wine was gone. The call from Clive Abernathy came on a Friday afternoon, about 3 weeks after the funeral. I was at my desk, working through a stack of correspondence that had accumulated, and when I saw his number, I assumed it was a routine update. Property valuation confirmed, perhaps, or a question about a specific account. It was neither. "Mr. Okafor," he said, in his measured way, "I need to bring something to your attention, and I want to do so directly because I think you'd expect that of me." The phrasing alone was enough. I put down my pen. "Go ahead. I received a call earlier this week from a woman who identified herself as your wife. She had your grandmother's full name, the address, and a reasonable amount of contextual detail. She was asking about the breakdown of assets, specifically about the property valuation and the investment holdings. She framed it as needing the information for your joint financial planning. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was doing the thing I always do when something unexpected lands. Not reacting, just taking it in, mapping it. "I don't have a wife," I said. "No," said Clive. "I thought that was likely the case. I did not provide any information. I told her that I could only correspond with the named beneficiary or their legal representative, and that any further inquiries should come through you directly. She thanked me and ended the call. You're certain it was a woman? Entirely. Did she give a name? She gave your surname. Said she was Mrs. Okafor. I absorbed that. Mrs. Okafor. Nadia's last name was Hartley. We had never discussed marriage in any concrete sense. There was no ring, no conversation, no understanding of that kind. She had, on her own initiative, picked up a phone and introduced herself to a solicitor as my wife in order to extract financial information about a dead woman's estate. Clive, I said, thank you. I want you to know I mean that sincerely. I thought you'd want to know, he said simply. There was no drama in it. Just the matter-of-fact delivery of a man who had seen a great many things in this line of work and had long since decided that his job was to be straight with people. We talked for another few minutes about legitimate estate matters. I kept my voice even throughout. When I hung up, I sat very still for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I opened my laptop and logged into our joint bank account. I had set up the joint account about 18 months earlier for shared household expenses, groceries, utility bills, the occasional joint purchase. It made sense at the time. It was practical. I'd contributed the lion's share because my income was higher, but that had always been the arrangement, and it had never been a point of tension. At least, not when I noticed. I started scrolling back through the transaction history. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I think some part of me already suspected that the solicitor's call wasn't a solitary event, that it was a symptom of something rather than the thing itself. I found it in the transfers. Not obvious at first. Nadia occasionally transferred money between accounts for things she'd bought online, or to split costs with friends, or for reasons she'd explain later in passing. I never scrutinized it closely. That had been a choice, a deliberate posture of not being the kind of person who monitors his partner's spending like a forensic accountant. I had trusted her. The account existed on the basis of that trust. But over the preceding 6 weeks, the outgoing transfers told a different story. 1,200 here, 800 there. A transfer of 3,000 that I had no memory of discussing. Smaller ones scattered between 400, 600, 250. I pulled up a spreadsheet and started entering them in order dating back to shortly after the funeral. When I reached the total, I sat back in my chair. 18,340 pounds. Gone. To an account I didn't recognize. Not her main current account. Not the one I knew. Something else. Something separate. I looked at the timing again. She had started the week after Grand's funeral. The week I'd told her about the inheritance. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it would be easy to describe it as anger or betrayal or some operatic emotion that swept me under. It wasn't that. It was colder than that. It was the specific, clarifying sensation of understanding something completely, of having a shape you couldn't quite identify suddenly snap into focus. She had done the arithmetic. She had looked at what was coming and decided that my grandmother's money would arrive and absorb the shortfall, and I would either not notice or not make a point of it. She had decided that I was, at bottom, the kind of man who could be quietly redistributed. She had miscalculated. I closed the laptop. I looked out the window for a moment at the gray afternoon. Then I picked up my phone and called my own solicitor. His name was Raymond Achabe. He was a friend of a friend, originally, a man who'd moved from corporate law into general practice some years back, and he had the particular quality of making complex things feel manageable without ever pretending they were simple. I explained the situation to him in full. The solicitor's call, the account, the figure. I was methodical about it. I didn't editorialize. When I finished, there was a brief pause. Right, he said. First thing this afternoon, separate the accounts. Move your contributions out of anything joint. Do it now before into business. Document the current state of the account before you touch anything. Screenshots, transaction history exported to PDF, the lot. Already ahead of you on the documentation. I'll move the money now. Good. Don't close the joint account yet. That comes later, once you've got legal advice on the paper trail. Did she have signatory rights? Joint account, so yes. Shared household expenses account, or a general? Household, nominally. That was the stated purpose. Good. That matters. The framing of the account's purpose is relevant if this goes further. He paused again. The solicitor call. That's a separate matter and potentially a more serious one, depending on what she said and how she represented herself. She said she was my wife. Another pause, this one longer. Right. Keep that record too. Get the solicitor's written confirmation of the call, date, time, what was said. That's important. We talked for another 20 minutes. By the time I put the phone down, I had a clear sequence of steps and the particular steadiness that comes from having a plan. I spent the next 2 hours being methodical. I exported every transaction from the joint account going back 18 months into a PDF and saved it in 3 places. I took dated screenshots. I transferred my own funds into a private account I opened that afternoon. The kind of thing that takes 20 minutes online if you move efficiently. I composed a message to Clive Abernathy, thanking him formally and asking him to send me a written account of the call he described for my records. He responded within the hour. Efficient man. I'd already thought well of him, but that confirmed it. Then I redirected the inheritance, which had not yet fully cleared, into the new private account. That required a call to the estate administrator and a brief explanation. They were accommodating. By 5 o'clock, the joint account held only what it had held before I touched it, minus my contributions. I moved my money. Hers, whatever she'd put in, which had always been less, remained. I closed my laptop and made tea. Nadia came home at 6:30. She came in through the front door, calling my name in the easy way she did, dropping her bag in the hallway with a thud. I heard her moving into the kitchen, the sound of the fridge opening. I was sitting in the living room with a book I hadn't been reading. Long day, she called out. Do you want to order in? Or, are you cooking? I'm not particularly hungry, I said. She appeared in the doorway with a glass of water. She was still in her work clothes, dark blazer, hair pulled back. She looked at me for a moment with the particular attention that a person gives you when the atmosphere in a room is not quite what they expected. You all right? She said. Tired, I said. A lot of estate stuff today. It was true. It was not the whole truth. But I wasn't going to have this conversation tonight, and I wasn't going to have it unprepared. I needed 36 more hours to finalize the account closure and ensure my documentation was complete. Raymond had advised me to wait until I had everything buttoned up before I said anything. So I waited. She came and sat on the sofa and asked about the estate in the way she often did. Practical questions, solicitous, interested. I answered them. I kept my voice level. I watched her without watching her. She's not nervous, I noted, somewhere in the back of my mind. That's interesting. She had no idea the solicitor had called me. She thought she'd been smooth. She thought she'd gathered her intelligence and covered her tracks, and that the money she'd moved was simply sitting there, waiting to be lost in the incoming tide of my grandmother's estate. I answered her questions. I said goodnight first. I slept without difficulty, which surprised me slightly, but perhaps it shouldn't have. There was nothing left to discover. I already knew what I needed to know. Saturday, I went to visit Gran's grave. I stopped at the florist near the churchyard and bought freesias, pale yellow ones, her favorite. She'd always said roses were for people who wanted to be noticed and freesias were for people with actual taste. I don't know where she got that from. Probably herself. The churchyard was quiet. A cool morning, the kind where you can see your breath in short puffs. I stood at the grave for a while and talked to her the way you do when you're alone and no one can hear you and you're past caring whether it's strange. I told her the estate was being handled properly. I told her that Clive Abernathy was, in my estimation, an excellent solicitor and she had chosen well. I told her I was dealing with a situation that she would have had opinions about and that her opinions would almost certainly have been correct. I laid the Freesias against the stone. I stayed until I felt like I'd said what I'd come to say. Then I drove home. That afternoon, I closed a joint account. The bank required a brief conversation and some forms, but it was handled without incident. The remaining balance, the small amount that had been Nadia's contribution, was transferred to her personal account. I documented the closure. Then I sat down and wrote the message. I kept it short. I had drafted it 3 times, and the third draft was by far the best because it contained no emotion and no accusation, just facts stated plainly with specificity. Nadia, over the past 6 weeks, £18,340 was transferred from our joint account to an account I don't have records for. These transactions began shortly after my grandmother's funeral and were not discussed with me. I've closed the joint account and separated our finances. I'm requesting repayment of this amount within 30 days. I have full documentation of the transfers and have taken legal advice. Please respond in writing. I read it twice. It said exactly what I intended it to say and nothing more. I sent it. Then I put my phone face down on the desk and made a pot of coffee and read a book for the rest of the evening. A real one this time. Her first response came 40 minutes later. What? Can we please just talk about this? This is really unfair. I read it. I put the phone down. I picked it up again an hour later. Her second response, sent 20 minutes after the first. I used some of that for things for US, for our home. I don't understand why you're making this into something. Third response, another 15 minutes on. I can't believe you do this without even talking to me first. This is really hurtful. I read all 3 in sequence and noted the progression, the feigned confusion, the justification, the pivot to being the injured party. It was a tidy little arc. I had seen it before in other contexts, in other people, and I found it neither surprising nor particularly upsetting. Well, I found it was clarifying. Every message she sent was one more document for the file. I didn't respond that night. She came home later than usual. I heard her key in the lock and the particular quality of her footsteps, quick, decisive, loaded with purpose. She came into the living room, and I could see she'd been working herself up to something in the car. We need to talk, she said. All right, I said. I put my book down. I didn't get up. She sat in the armchair opposite me, which was notable. She usually sat beside me on the sofa. She was positioning this as a confrontation, which told me she decided that the best strategy was to take the offensive. I noted it and waited. I don't know what you think you've found, she said, but pulling money out of joint account and sending me a message like that without a single conversation first that's not something I expected from you. The message was the conversation, I said. Everything I needed to say was in it. That's not how you handle things in a relationship. You don't send someone a legal-sounding message and just, Nadia. I kept my voice quiet and even. £18,340. Over 6 weeks. Starting the week of my grandmother's funeral. Tell me about those transfers. A beat. Something shifted in her face, not quite imperceptible, but close. She recovered quickly. I used money for things we needed. For the household. I was going to tell you. Which household expenses? Various things. Name one. She met my eyes. I don't have every receipt memorized. Where did the transfers go? That's not a household account I recognize. Another pause, briefer this time. She changed direction. I knew money was coming in. From the estate. I thought. You thought it would cover it. It wasn't. I wasn't trying to. You thought my grandmother's money would arrive and you'd absorb what you'd already spent and I wouldn't look closely enough to notice, or if I noticed, I wouldn't make an issue of it. I said it in the same calm register. No rise, no accusation in the tone. Just the things said plainly. That's what you thought. She opened her mouth and then closed it. And separately, I said, you called Clive Abernathy, Grand Solicitor. You told him you were my wife. The color in her face shifted. I watched it happen. She hadn't expected that. She had thought that call was clean, untraceable, forgotten the moment she'd hung up. She started. You identified yourself as Mrs. Okafor. You asked about the asset breakdown. He didn't give you anything, and he called me. I just wanted to understand the situation. I was trying to. You were trying to find out how much money there was before I told you, so you could plan accordingly. The silence that followed was not brief. It had weight in it. She was recalculating. I could see it, trying to find the angle that worked. I had been in enough difficult conversations to recognize that particular stillness, the slight unfocus of someone mentally flipping through their options. I love you, she said finally, quietly. I looked at her. That's not relevant to what I'm asking. It's not relevant. Her voice went up slightly. I'm telling you I love you, and it's not relevant. To the 18,000 pounds? No, it's not. She shifted forward in the chair. I can't believe you're treating this like some kind of transaction. We've been together for years. You know me. I thought I did. I said it simply, not to wound, just as a statement of fact. That's rather the point. This is so cold. You know that? This is cold. She shook her head. Your grandmother just died. You're going through something enormous, and instead of leaning on me, you're going through bank statements, and don't do that. She stopped. Don't make this about grief, I said, and my voice had the same quiet register had held throughout. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that. To myself, as much as anything. There was no anger. There was something else, something that was perhaps more uncomfortable for her than anger would have been, which was that I was simply not moved. You started moving money the week of the funeral. Using my grandmother's death as cover for the timing was not something I did. That was yours. She pressed her lips together. I'm not here to argue, I said. You have 30 days. If you have questions about the documentation, put them in writing and I'll respond in writing. She stood up. I expected an exit, maybe a raised voice, maybe the door. Instead, she stood there for a moment longer. You're really doing this, she said. Already did it, I said. The account's closed. The money's separated. The documentation is with my solicitor. I sent you a message outlining what you owe. That part is done. And us. I looked at her steadily. What would you like me to say? Her chin lifted slightly. That this isn't over. That you're not. That we can talk about this like adults. We're talking about it. You know what I mean? I didn't know what she meant. She meant, tell me this is fixable. Tell me you'll absorb this. Tell me you're the kind of man who makes a fuss and then backs down when I show up and say the right things. She meant, I'm betting you care more about keeping this than about the principle. She had miscalculated again. Nadia, I said, you posed as my wife to extract financial information from my grandmother's solicitor. You transferred more than 18,000 pounds from a shared account without discussion, timed specifically to a bereavement. And when I confronted you with it, your first instinct was to question my emotional temperature. I paused. There isn't a version of those facts that I can talk my way around. She left the room. I heard the bedroom door close, not slammed, but shut with a firmness that communicated what a slam would have been too obvious to communicate. I sat in the living room for a few minutes and noted, with some detachment, that I felt fine. Not fine in the sense of unaffected. I'd been with this woman for a long time. There was something like sadness in the vicinity, but underneath it, a bedrock steadiness. I had done what needed doing. I had done it without cruelty and without performance. Every step had been measured and documented and clean. I picked up my book and found my page. The following week had its own uncomfortable texture. We were living in the same space, but in different registers. She was alternating between reproachful silence and periodic attempts to revisit the conversation on different terms. On Monday, she tried sympathy. I know you're not yourself right now. Grief does strange things. On Wednesday, she tried pragmatics. We should at least talk about the practical situation. I can't just produce 18,000 pounds. On Thursday, she left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter that said, "I miss you," and nothing else. I read the note. I folded it and put it aside for the file. Not because I thought it was cynical, it might not have been, but it was also not relevant to the 30-day clock. Raymond Achebe had a brief conversation with me midweek. He'd reviewed the documentation I'd sent him and was satisfied with its completeness. The solicitor call is the interesting one, he said. Impersonating a spouse to obtain financial information from a legal professional. That's not nothing. I know, I said. I'm not looking to escalate if it isn't necessary. Understood, but it's worth having as part of the record. If the repayment happens clean within the 30 days, then arguably you don't need it. But if she decides to make this complicated, then we use it. Then we have it. He was thorough. I trusted him. On Friday of that week, Nadia came and sat at the kitchen table while I was having breakfast. She had the look of someone who had rehearsed something. I put down my coffee and gave her my attention. "I want you to understand something," she said. She was composed. She'd worked at the composure, I could tell. "I made a mistake. A serious one. I know that. But I need you to understand why." She paused. "I've felt, for a long time, like I'm on the outside of your life. Like you keep a part of yourself locked away and I can never reach it. And when the inheritance came up, I think I panicked. I thought, if I could just understand the full picture, I could figure out where I fit. I listened to all of it. I waited until she was finished. So, the transfers?" I said. She looked down briefly. I was scared. I thought, I don't know. I thought if I had something separate, something that was mine, I'd feel more secure. "You moved nearly 20,000 pounds into a separate account because you felt insecure. When you say it like that, is there another way to say it?" She was quiet. "Nadia, you've offered me 2 different explanations in the same conversation for the same set of actions. You've told me it was for household expenses, and now you've told me it was for your own security. I'm not going to help you choose the one that's more sympathetic." I said it without edge. "The 30 days stands." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something that, of everything she'd said in this past week, struck me as closest to the truth she'd been avoiding. "I didn't think you'd actually do anything about it." There it was. "I know," I said. She had not been reckless. She had been calculating. She had looked at me, at what she thought I was, and she had concluded that I was available to be managed, that I would see the charges, feel the friction of confrontation, weigh it against the relationship, and quietly let it go, that I was at bottom a man who could be bet against. The miscalculation was not an accident. It was a character assessment, and she had got it wrong. "I'm going to stay at Freys for a bit," she said quietly. "All right," I said. "I'll get some things this afternoon." "All right." She started to get up and then stopped. One more attempt. Not manipulative this time, I thought, just genuine, the last actual card she had left. "Was there any version of this where you would have talked to me first? Before you went to the solicitor, before you separated the accounts? If I'd come to you before all of this, before the solicitor called me, or before I checked the account?" She nodded. I considered it. I gave it real consideration, because she deserved that, and because I try not to be dishonest even when honesty isn't comfortable. "If you'd come to me," I said, "after the first or second transfer, and told me you'd moved money you shouldn't have and you were scared and you needed to figure it out together." Yes. There was a version of that where we talked about it, where I tried to understand. I paused. "But you didn't do that. You made 18 transfers over 6 weeks. You called a solicitor and told them you were my wife. That's not a moment of panic that you step back from. That's a sustained plan. She absorbed that. I watched her absorb it. I see, she said. She packed a bag that afternoon. She was dignified about it, which I appreciated. She took what was hers, left what wasn't, and let herself out with her key, which she posted back through the letterbox on her way out. The small metallic sound of it landing on the hallway floor was, in its way, tidier than anything she could have said. I went back to the churchyard 3 weeks later. Another Saturday, clearer this time, the light actually doing what light is supposed to do. I stopped at the same florist. More freesias, yellow again. I stood at the grave for a while. The stone was still new-looking. Give it a season and the weather would start to work on it, soften the edges, and it would look like it had always been there, the way the older ones do. I thought Graham would prefer that. She'd never liked anything that looked too polished. It's handled, I told her. The estate, the account, everything documented and in order. You'd approve of Clive, if you didn't already know to. I looked down at the freesias I'd laid against the stone. The other situation is resolving itself. 30 days is almost up. I had received 2 more written messages from Nadia in the 3 weeks since she'd left. The first was an attempt to renegotiate the amount, suggesting that some of the transfers could be attributed to shared expenses, and could we please discuss a revised figure. I had responded with a list of every transaction and asked her to identify specifically which ones she was claiming as household costs, with supporting documentation. She had not responded to that. The second message had come the previous Thursday. It was longer. It moved through several phases, apologetic at the start, then reasoning, then something that had the shape of an ultimatum without quite being one. It ended with a request to meet for coffee and talk properly, just the 2 of us without the solicitors in the background. I had not yet responded. I was considering whether a response was necessary or whether silence, in this case, was sufficient communication. Raymond's view was that I should respond in writing, briefly, restating the terms and the deadline. I was inclined to agree. I laid my hand on the top of the headstone for a moment. The stone was cold. The morning was cold. It was not an unpleasant kind of cold. You always said know what you're worth, I said. I do. I haven't forgotten. It was something she used to say. She'd say it in the context of all kinds of things, not just money, not just work, but decisions, relationships, the way you let people treat you. Know what you're worth, and don't negotiate down from it out of loneliness. She had extremely little patience for self-betrayal. She would diagnose it in a person within about 4 minutes of meeting them, and then spend the rest of the interaction finding ways to call it out. I think she would have spotted Nadia's play before I did. She had that kind of eye. I stayed until I felt ready to leave, and then I walked back to the car in the clear morning light and drove home. The 30 days expired on a Tuesday, same day of the week as the phone call that had started all of this, which I noticed without putting too much weight on it. By 11 that morning, I had received no bank transfer and no written commitment to pay. I called Raymond. Nothing, I said. Right, he said. Then we proceed. I'll send the formal letter today. Registered post. That begins the next phase. Do it. How are you holding up? It was a genuine question. He asked it that way. Fine, I said. Better than I expected. Honestly. Good. This is going to get slightly more unpleasant before it resolves. She'll respond to the letter, probably with a counterposition, maybe with her own legal advice. It might get messy. Let it. He made a small sound of approval. That's the right posture. I put the phone down and sat at my desk for a moment. Outside, it was another gray morning, the light flat and non-committal. Inside, everything was as it should be. My files were in order. My accounts were separate. My grandmother's estate had been handled with the care it deserved. Every step had been taken deliberately, documented, and clean. I had not raised my voice. I had not pleaded. I had not, at any point, allowed the discomfort of the situation to move me faster or slower than was wise. I had been, I thought, exactly who I intended to be. The formal letter would arrive at Freya's address by Thursday. Nadia would open it, and it would no longer be possible to mistake it for a bad patch or a negotiation or a temporary winter in an otherwise stable relationship. It would be at that point, what it had always been from the moment I understood what she had done, a matter of record. I opened my laptop and started the morning's work. Somewhere, in whatever it is that remains after a person is gone, I like to think Gran had an opinion about all of this. I like to think she would have nodded once in the particular tight-lipped way she had that meant well, then, and turned back to her allotment. That's enough. That's all I need.
Thanks for listening.